Hello, this is Gumbo Craig. Greetings in the name of Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Messiah. Today, our offering is Archie's Teenage Wasteland, 80 Years of the Riverdale Working. Please enjoy the accompanying slideshow, which is intended to complement but not precisely parallel the voiceover narrative, although it does so occasionally, perhaps serendipitously. Archie and the gang from Riverdale have always defined teenage. Indeed, they are largely responsible for inventing the concept in the comic book format, based on the box office powerhouse Andy Hardy movies featuring Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland. This, in turn, has been part of a broader social engineering, what we call a magical working, based on the occult craft. Most essentially, the Riverdale working is conjured to turn young people away from spiritual light and toward the darkness. This continues even as the CW's Riverdale show has jumped 5 years in the future, taking our high schoolers into their young adult lives. The Riverdale working has played a major role in segregating youth from adult guidance, sanctioning counter-Christ values such as hypersexuality, materialism, interest in the occult, and false stereotyping of the followers of Messiah and the way itself. In the process, Archie and the Riverdale working has done its part to dissolve bonds of family into chaos, so as to forge the manacles of the new order unfolding now before our very eyes. The road to Archie Comics, paved by its founders, was not as innocent wholesome as its later image. The driving creative forces from the early days were publisher John Goldwater and writer Bob Montana, along with publishing partners Maurice Coyne and Louis Silberkleit. Not surprisingly, none came from a Christian background, which possibly made it easier to start their publishing ventures in the pulps and low-rent girly magazines, which paid the bills for 2 years before the appearance of Archie. Goldwater, a relative of the Arizona senator and 1964 presidential nominee of the same name, it does seem like most public noteworthies are related in some way, had an unfortunate origin and spotty early life that is a logical precedent for the darkness and moral ambiguity in today's Archie Comics and the CW's Riverdale. His mother died during his childbirth and his father from the subsequent stress shortly thereafter. He went west to Kansas and eventually San Francisco as a young man, becoming a reporter on high school sports in Hiawatha, Kansas, where he says he got a lot of his ideas for the Archie characters. He got more ideas returning home from San Francisco to New York by ship and juggling romances with 2 girls he met on board, foreshadowing Archie's double-mindedness with Betty and Veronica. The ginger embodiment of average all-American youth debuted in Pep Comics number 22, cover dated the month and year of Pearl Harbor, December 1941. Number 22 being an appropriately dualistic number for the gematria-minded. He was a typical teenager, except for the very socially frowned upon practice of having 2 girlfriends at the same time. Here we see self-centered hedonism and lack of commitment edging out sincere relationship and genuine caring. Archie is the double-minded man in the Bible's Book of James 1, verse 8. Archie's inaugural debut in Pep Comics number 22 also introduced what would be pervasive allusions to Freemasonry. Archie, at that early date preferring the moniker Chick, attempts to impress his new neighbor's Betty, but clumsily crashes his head through her father's prized framed picture of himself in lodge uniform, as in Fraternal Society Lodge or Masonic Lodge. The Riverdale of the comics also features an athletic character named Moose Mason, and Veronica's father, Hiram Lodge. Several actual Freemasonic lodges in the United States are named Hiram Lodge in honor of Hiram Abiff, or Hiram Abiff, the mystical magical architect of Solomon's Temple murdered in Freemasonic lore. Archie got his own title a few months after this debut and ran for 3/4 of a century, ceasing with issue 666. Move along, nothing to see here, of course, but ending a 74-year run of a series of comics with the number of the beast from John's Book of Revelation in the Bible sort of strains the credibility of random chance. Besides, this wasn't the only place the Antichrist number popped up in Archie Comics. Also in 2015, a completely different set of writers made conspicuous mention of this conspicuous number. The intentionally campy and very gory Archie vs. Sharknado is a takeoff on the film series featuring Beverly Hills 90210's Ian Ziering about a world plagued by man-eating sharks ejected by the dozens in metropolitan areas from tornadoes. In the comic book, Moose Mason asks Reggie how many times he's pounded him for flirting with Midge. As the big guy dangles him over the deck of the boat, Reggie answers, 666? Maybe 667? Why name any number? Why name that number? Certainly not by coincidence. Immediately following this issue 666, the Archie universe was reinvented to appeal to a new audience of teens and adults under the stewardship of co-founder grandson Jonathan Goldwater and writer Mark Waid, whose high-quality work had proved popular in the pages of The Flash, Fantastic Four, Daredevil, Captain America, and one of the most esteemed DC limited series of all time, Superman Birthright. But it was a macabre comic book series, a zombie apocalypse entitled Afterlife with Archie by Roberto Aguirre Sacasa, that was to provide the rudder by which the Archie characters and Riverdale would steer the ship of youth and thus the future into dark, deep, and unprecedentedly blood-splattered territory. Aguirre Sacasa's direction would prove so valuable to the powers that be that his relationship with Archie Comics went from being the object of a lawsuit in 2003 to being the showrunner of the CW's Riverdale series and the chief creative officer for Archie Comics. Rest assured, Aguirre Sacasa has exactly the kind of global elite credentials you'd expect from someone charged with training up the youth for the New World Order. He has certainly also displayed the requisite supernatural occult orientation in his work to foster that elite's goal of constructing a counter-Christ future. Aguirre Sacasa is the son of a World Bank official who also served as Nicaragua's ambassador to the United States and the foreign minister of his nation. His collegiate resume is an Ivy League Grand Slam featuring the Jesuits' Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., McGill in Canada, and Yale, a standard-bearer for the Eastern Establishment. The plays he wrote at Yale were all of a supernatural bent, including one item entitled Say You Love Satan, for which he received the LGBTQ+ accolade GLAAD, G-L-A-A-D, Media Award. 2003, the same year he graduated Yale with a graduate degree in the dramatic arts, Aguirre Sacasa wrote Archie's Weird Fantasy, about the Riverdale redhead coming out of the queer closet and moving to New York. Just prior to opening night, Archie Comics issued a cease and desist order, feeling the time was not right to identify Archie with gay issues. So Roberto Aguirre Sacasa is not just a Barrio success story, as I had hoped when I first saw his name, but a certified blue blood, amply rewarded and recognized by the powers that be. He is precisely the kind of guy who would get picked to do his part to facilitate a cultural transition to the counter-Christ world of our transhuman future. But Archie Comics has been a part of this working for a long, long time, shaping the axiomatic assumptions, morals, and beliefs of tweeners, teens, and 20-somethings. We have taken a brief look at the people who guided Archie in the beginning and what their values and worldview might have been. I believe that Archie and Riverdale constitute a spell, an enchantment intended to help transform the world into a more malleable setting to obscure the presence and plan of God for humanity's redemption. This is ultimately the goal of the ancient rebellion against God and the war on his human family. This Riverdale working has for 80 plus years furthered the development and acceptance of the counter-Christ values of hypersexuality, materialism, narcissism, and the occult. Alan Moore and Grant Morrison, two of the most lauded comic book writers, live out their conviction that all art is shamanism, with public endorsement of and incitement to magical practices. In another sense, all creativity not specifically dedicated to the glory of God is by default commandeered by less lofty and less benevolent spirits to become a working, that is to say, an act of occult magic to evoke or produce a specific outcome. On a micro level, workings are intended to evoke and produce a desire for gnosis, a heretofore secret knowledge or understanding that will eventually enable its recipient to achieve godlike consciousness and abilities. On the macro level, the great work of the Freemasons and other repositories of the Mystery Babylon religions is to unite the world under the elite management of those aforementioned godlike recipients of gnosis and their ethereal patrons. These patrons include assorted entities whom biblicist Christians would umbrella under the rubric unclean spirits. We live in a world where this elite management, the rich and powerful and their key operative elements, use any and all means to stay elite, rich, and powerful. As they forge the transhumanist future, they will also work to stay alive on this earth indefinitely, avoiding, so they hope, the judgment of God. In the meantime, they require the passivity and even the consent of the rest of us. Nothing has served this end more effectively these last 2 centuries than popular culture. Since the 1840s advent of blackface minstrelsy and the spiritualism movement's simultaneous fascination with raising the dead, pop culture has been, in effect, if not by design, the most potent tool for shaping our beliefs, attitudes, values, aspirations, and ideas about the nature of reality and what it is to be human. So after a century of honing its culture-shaping skills, pop culture gives us Archie and the Kids from Riverdale in 1941. As stated, Archie, Betty, Jughead, and Veronica practically invented teenage. Inspired by Mickey Rooney's Andy Hardy series, 1937 to 1946, the characters of Riverdale likewise reflected preoccupations with money, cars, materialism, and the opposite sex. Consistent and repetitive stories in newspapers and comics served up light-hearted fare of youthful folly in pursuit of these irresistible post-depression baubles of American prosperity. In this idealized ordinary America, the rich mantles and lodges, and later the Blossoms, mingle seamlessly with the less affluent Andrews and Coopers. All attend the same public school, peaceably more or less, in spite of much jostling for the holy grail of sexual attention and material reward. Religion dead or neutered for most, youth looks to pop culture for cues on how to feel and how to behave. For 80 years, Archie and the Riverdale gang have provided some of those cues. A few years ago, Craig Rowe published his coffee table book, Archie, a celebration of America's favorite teenagers. On the January 1950 cover of Pep Comics, Archie is touted as America's top teenager. Archie Comic Publications Interoffice Stationery from January 1956 bore the subtitle America's Leading Teenage Comic Group. My dad, 11 years old when Archie first appeared in Pep, claims he never heard the word teenager when he was a teenager. It had not yet crystallized into the universally recognized category it is today. Thomas Hine, The Rise and Fall of the American Teenager. The teenager is a social invention of the machine age, but we live in a different world now. Thomas Hine's book, The Rise and Fall of the American Teenager, tells us that the word teenager first came into use in the early 1940s to describe an age group that had suddenly become of great interest to marketers and social reformers. The American teenager was a New Deal project to get the young out of the workforce so that more jobs would be available to family men. For the first time, high schools were enrolling a majority of young people. During the late 1930s, Mickey Rooney, who furnished the prototype for Archie Andrews, provided a convincing and engaging model of arrested development. The build-up to a wartime economy provided teenagers with pocket money. Hines goes on to say that the teenager was a social invention of a time very different from our own, but unlike an outdated microprocessor, is very difficult to displace, or it has become embedded in the way we imagine the shape of people's lives. So here is the real teen tragedy. Adolescents had once been integrally interwoven with the adult world and were expected to play an important role in the life of the family as a worker or apprentice, or much less often as a student truly being trained for a future profession. All of a sudden, the New Deal, in fashioning the legacy of social engineering and massive government oversight to our lives, focused the attention of society's influential opinion makers on what would now become a gargantuan segregated subculture. This peer bubble would now be perpetually panicking down the rapids of the pathological, lacking the experience and social skills essential for decision-making, but making them nonetheless. Teens suddenly garnered a huge groundswell of attention from marketers and social reformers, which was then reflected by incessant media attention. This syndrome constitutes a drumbeat. That is, a topic pounded on over and over by media. You can't avoid it, and you can't get away from it. Drumbeats happen for a reason. They almost always serve a strategic purpose for one or more segments of the power elite. So what purpose did this new drumbeat of teenage serve in the 1940s? Well, in addition to the aforementioned provision of jobs to adult family men, teens segregated into high school provided a secure lab for social experiment and engineering psychological operations. Teen music, fashion, hangouts, films, and the behavior they engender rarely come from teens but are handed down to them from full-fledged adults or those under their direction. Adolescents, who were heretofore regarded as developing human beings, were now largely cut off from the guidance of a caring adult world. Teenagers were now manipulated to perceive that world as more and more irrelevant to their experience and unworthy of traditional respect and obedience. In place of serving the family and community, there is a preoccupation with self, individual choice, freedom, and expression trumps all other values. I have to follow my dream. I have to do what I want to do, not what you want me to do, becomes the mantra. Disney manages to admonish us in almost every offering to follow your heart, which the Bible assures us is wicked and deceitful above all things in Jeremiah 17:9. Problem is, A young people segregated from adults most often do not have the tools to make these choices wisely. And oh yeah, now they had access to cars, so socializing with their peer group wasn't much of a challenge. Neither was having sex. So the peer group and the pathological social concept of coolness became the entire meaningful world for the new teen culture of the 40s and 50s. Mickey Rooney at 26 stops playing teenage Andy Hardy in 1946, and his good-natured obsession with cars, money, and girls starts to give way 5 years later among some adolescents to the dark angst and nastiness of Catcher in the Rye's Holden Caulfield. In the Riverdale series, Veronica refers to Jughead as Riverdale's resident Holden Caulfield, a title that later is passed to Betty Cooper. Grace Elizabeth Hale, who did such an exquisite job with her book Making Whiteness, The Culture of Segregation in the South, 1890 to 1940, scores again with her entry on segregation of teens and other rebels in her more recent A Nation of Outsiders, How the White Middle Class Fell in Love with Rebellion in Post-War America. She points out that the aforementioned Holden Caulfield from Catcher in the Rye, with every material advantage of many white teens in post-war America, is mired in the angst of an alienation that is personal, psychological, and spiritual. He sees adult behavior as phony and substitutes an equally phony but much nastier cult of authenticity that would later blossom in pop musical movements like the folk revival and the Laurel Canyon hippie singer-songwriters. According to Hale, Caulfield is in love with his own alienation and the romance of the outsider. This will be a consistent thread in teen anti-culture to our own day and is the life's blood of television's Riverdale. In the Archie Comics world, the alienation is a lighter fare, but America's favorite teens are clearly set apart from an adult society which offers little other than annoying rules, outbursts of temper, and a bumbling incompetence in providing anything akin to mentoring and leadership. Pop mainlines them sugar at his chocolate shop. Mr. Weatherby goes apoplectic over the chaos caused by Archie's clumsiness at school. Mrs. Grundy, the teacher, epitomizes the repressive spinster schoolmarm, and moms and dads are seldom little more than lovingly tolerated figures who really don't understand the much more sophisticated world of the teenagers. In lieu of honoring thy mother and thy father, Hine points out that popular culture steps in, fueled by the participation of the novelty-seeking, perennially insecure young. Hine also notes the teenage preoccupation with legal age, minimum ages for drinking liquor, smoking cigarettes, and gambling legally, which become important passages to maturity. The mark of adulthood in America is the license to indulge in sin and bad habits. High school is the organizing social principle for Archie and his peers in Riverside. From its widespread inception, this institution gave teens a chance to control their own social life, something that parents had done for them before. Hine notes that that high school was a fairly, not too much engaged in concept and a fairly recent phenomenon in history, taking root in World War II, and was intended to indoctrinate youth with middle-class standards. Instead, segregating young people in universal high school education gave teenagers the chance to set standards of their own. I recently was audience to an example of adolescents setting their own standards for sexual engagement in a 13-year-old girl's declaration that if you don't have sex, you're considered a wimp. Not surprisingly, she did not end her freshman year a wimp. But many parents seem to have tacitly decided a long time ago that it's okay for underage children to have sex with each other. That's progress and freedom for you. An additional upshot of teenage is the atomization and gradual disintegration of the family into the dysfunctional entities, institutional assemblages, and quote-unquote families we choose as our tribe for varying lengths of time. Into the parenting authority vacuum steps movies and television, internet and music, inculcating our values and stylizing our behavior. The bonding and passing on of values through dinner table conversation has eroded in America almost to the point of vanishing. Hine points out that we have teens doing nothing but waiting for adulthood in ways that are dissatisfying and ineffective. He proposes that we consider that the idea of the teenager is one that has outlived its usefulness, then move on to other possibilities. So with teens segregated into peer groups at high school, through music and at hangouts, they become fertile soil and blank slates for social engineering by a power elite looking for complacent workers who believe they are free. The teenagers defined in part by Archie and Riverdale are also spiritual vacuums to fill with a watered-down version of their own Gnostic occultism as the Christian era completely disintegrates into the post-Christian age of Horus, the crowned and conquering child, to use the term of the Luciferian Aleister Crowley, otherwise known as the self-proclaimed Great Beast or 666. So that lays the foundation for what the occult Riverdale working is all about. In our next installments, we will drill down very closely on the fetish of darkness depicted in the CW's Riverdale show, the chilling confessions of Sabrina, and the zombie apocalypse comic book series Afterlife with Archie. Please remember to like and share if you are so moved. It is such a big help and much appreciated. This is Gumbo Craig, wishing for the blessing of the Lord to you and all whom you love. In the name of Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Messiah, all glory to the Most High God. Shalom.